All right, let's talk about one of the most insidious, nightmarish, and nearly forgotten threats to ever crawl out of the warp: the Enslavers. You've heard of the Great Rift, the Horus Heresy, the Necron Awakening, and the Tyranid Hive fleets, but none of them come close to the existential horror these creatures represent. They didn't just threaten an empire. They nearly ended all sentient life in the galaxy, and worst of all, no one saw them coming. Imagine a horror so overwhelming that even the ancient Old Ones, the godlike architects of the galaxy's earliest civilizations, were powerless against it. A plague not of disease or war, but of possession, spreading like wildfire through the minds of psychers, turning them into conduits for monstrous entities lurking in the immaterium. These were not demons, nor were they manifestations of chaos. The Enslavers had no grand ideology, no sinister patron, no thirst for conquest. They were something far worse: pure, mindless, parasitic survival. At the height of their infestation, entire civilizations collapsed overnight. Planets, one by one, became barren wastelands, their populations either enslaved or annihilated in an unstoppable chain reaction of psychic infestation. And just as suddenly as they emerged, they vanished, fading into myth and obscurity, leaving behind ruins and silence. But here's the real question: did they ever truly leave? The galaxy is more vulnerable now than it has ever been, and the conditions that led to their rise are creeping back into reality. If the Enslavers were to return, would anything be able to stop them this time? The Enslavers are one of those terrifying mysteries of the Warhammer 40K universe that make you question whether the greatest threats truly come from chaos, the Tyranids, or even the Necrons. These creatures are neither demons nor conventional Xenos. They are something far worse: a force of nature, a psychic plague that spreads through thought alone. If you think of the warp as an ocean of nightmares, then the Enslavers are the deep-sea horrors that emerge only when conditions are just right. And when they do, civilizations fall. So what exactly are they? The Enslavers, also known as Sirens or Krell by those unfortunate enough to encounter them, are warp-based parasites that use sentient psychers as gateways into the material universe. Unlike demons, they have no need for rituals, chaos gods, or summoning rites. They simply latch onto the mind of a psychic being, slowly corrupting it until they can force open a rift between reality and the immaterium. Once that happens, the flood begins. More Enslavers pour through, each one searching for another host, expanding their reach in an exponential cycle of domination and infestation. Their method of control is even more horrifying than the demonic possessions seen with chaos. Instead of destroying the mind or forcing the host into madness, Enslavers hollow out their victims, reducing them to little more than puppets. The worst part? The victim remains conscious, trapped in their own body, unable to resist as they watch themselves enslaving others in turn. The process is disturbingly fast. A single psyker infected by an enslaver can doom an entire planet in a matter of days, as more and more bodies become unwilling conduits for the invasion. Physically, they are grotesque, described in ancient records as bulbous, floating creatures with long tendrils that act as both sensory organs and control mechanisms. Their bodies are amorphous, shifting between dimensions, half existing in the warp and half in real space. This makes them incredibly difficult to kill with conventional weapons. Even if you manage to destroy their physical form, their essence lingers in the immaterium, waiting for the next opportunity to break through. Some theories suggest that they don't even have true bodies at all, that what we see in real space is just a manifestation, a projection of something far larger and more nightmarish lurking deep in the warp. Now here's where things get really disturbing. Unlike chaos, Enslavers have no agenda, no ideology, no desire for power. They do not revel in destruction like the Tyranids, nor do they seek to corrupt reality like the ruinous powers. They simply exist to spread, consuming entire populations like a virus. This is what makes them such a unique and horrifying threat. There is no diplomacy, no surrender, no bargaining. They do not recognize fear or hatred. They do not even care about the civilizations they destroy. To them, everything in real space is just fuel for their survival. The origins of the Enslavers are shrouded in mystery. Some believe they are a natural part of the warp, a byproduct of the psychic energies that flow through the immaterium. Others think they were once a tool of the Old Ones, a weapon that spiraled out of control, much like the Krork and the Jokairo. But the most chilling theory? That they have always been here, waiting for the right conditions to return. And with the current state of the galaxy, the Cicatrix Maledictum tearing open reality, Psychers emerging at an unprecedented rate, and the Imperium more vulnerable than ever, those conditions might already be falling into place. The Enslaver Plague wasn't some sudden cataclysm like the Horus Heresy or the opening of the Great Rift. It was a slow, creeping disaster that built up over time, one that no one saw coming until it was too late. To understand how it began, you have to go back, way back, to a time before the Imperium, before even the Eldar ruled the stars, to the age of the Old Ones. This was an era when the galaxy was shaped by vast, godlike beings who manipulated the very fabric of life itself. And in their desperate struggle against their greatest enemy, they set in motion the very events that would lead to the Enslaver Plague. The Old Ones were masters of the warp, using it to move across the stars, bending reality to their will. But their true power came from their ability to uplift species, granting them intelligence and, in many cases, psychic potential. This was their ultimate weapon against the Necrons and their soulless Khitan overlords. Where the Necrons relied on brute force and necrodermis bodies, the Old Ones wielded armies of psychic warriors, races infused with the ability to manipulate the warp in ways no machine ever could. The Krork, the Jokairo, and the ancestors of the Eldar and the Orcs were all part of this grand strategy. And for a while, it worked. The war in heaven raged on, and the Necrons were pushed back. But here's the thing about playing with fire. You eventually get burned. The more psychic life flourished, the more turbulent and chaotic the warp became. It had once been a stable dimension, shaped by the will of the Old Ones. But with thousands of new psychic minds igniting across the galaxy, the Immaterium began to churn and boil in ways that even they couldn't control. This was the true beginning of the nightmare. And then, at the worst possible moment, the Old Ones vanished. No one knows exactly how or why. Some say the Necrons finally found a way to destroy them, while others believe they simply abandoned the galaxy, realizing that their war was unwinnable. Whatever the case, their disappearance left a power vacuum, and the species they had uplifted were left to fend for themselves. At first, it seemed like these civilizations might survive. The Eldar were rising, building their vast empire, and other psychic species were thriving in their own ways. But then, the plague began. It started quietly. A few isolated psychers on distant worlds began acting strangely. Their thoughts became erratic, their dreams haunted by alien whispers. They became obsessed, staring into the void for hours, speaking in tongues no one understood. And then, without warning, they opened doors that were never meant to be opened. The Enslavers poured through. Once they entered real space, the spread was unstoppable. Every psyker they infested became a gateway, allowing more to enter. Entire planets fell within weeks, their populations reduced to mindless thralls, puppets dancing to the will of their new masters. The Eldar, still young and arrogant, believed they could contain the crisis. They were wrong. The psychic resonance of their own empire only made things worse, feeding the Enslavers, giving them more access points, more hosts to infest. Some civilizations tried to fight back, but how do you fight an enemy that doesn't have a physical army, one that turns your own people into its soldiers? Bombardment was useless, as Enslaver-controlled psychers simply reached out into the warp and tore open more rifts. Some races tried to isolate themselves, cutting off all psychic activity. That worked, for a while, but all it took was one mistake, one unshielded mind, and the cycle would begin again. By the time the plague reached its peak, the galaxy was drowning in psychic fire. Empires collapsed. Countless species were wiped out entirely, their names erased from history. The Eldar barely survived, and only because their own innate psychic power was disciplined and controlled. But even they feared that this was the end. The Enslaver plague wasn't just a disaster. It was a warning, a lesson in what happens when the warp is pushed too far, when psychic power is allowed to flourish without restraint. And here's the terrifying part. The galaxy has not learned that lesson. If anything, it has made the same mistakes all over again. The Imperium, despite all its superstitions, is flooded with psychers. The Eldar are barely holding their civilization together. And the Great Rift has torn open reality itself, unleashing more psychic energy than ever before. If the conditions that led to the first Enslaver plague are returning, then the question isn't if they will come back, it's when. The moment the Enslavers found their way into real space, the galaxy had already lost. It wasn't a war in the traditional sense. There were no battle lines, no armies to fight, no grand strategies that could turn the tide. The Enslaver plague wasn't a conflict. It was an unstoppable infestation, an avalanche that gained speed with every mind it consumed. And the worst part? No one saw it coming until entire planets were already lost. The spread was horrifyingly fast. It started with isolated cases, lone psychers on distant worlds who became infected, their minds unraveling as the Enslavers burrowed in. But unlike most warp-based threats, the Enslavers didn't need rituals or worshippers to cross the veil. They needed only one unprotected mind, one conduit strong enough to act as a doorway, and then the flood began. One psyker became 2, 2 became 4, 4 became 16. The numbers multiplied exponentially, an infection spreading at the speed of thought. On every world where they emerged, the pattern was the same. First, the psychers went silent, their minds no longer their own. Then, those around them began to change. Loved ones, friends, family, all turning into mindless extensions of the Enslavers' will. Governments and military forces barely had time to react. By the time a planet realized what was happening, its leaders were already enslaved. And then came the real horror. The sky would tear open, and more Enslavers would pour through, their hideous tendril-covered forms floating down like bloated parasites, descending on a fresh corpse. Entire cities were transformed into grotesque hives of living conduits, each host acting as a beacon, drawing in more and more of the creatures. The few who managed to escape told stories of entire populations turned into puppets, their eyes hollow, their movements stiff and unnatural. No one spoke, no one resisted. The people of these worlds simply stood in eerie silence, staring blankly into the sky, waiting for the next stage of their master's plan. The few civilizations that still had the strength to fight back tried everything. Conventional weapons were useless. Killing the infected did nothing, because the true enemy was never in real space to begin with. Psychic shielding helped, but only for a time. It was like trying to hold back a flood with a handful of sandbags. As long as there were psychers, the Enslavers had a foothold. Some planets resorted to the unthinkable. There are records, fragments, buried deep in lost archives, of entire worlds that chose to exterminate their own populations rather than risk falling to the plague. Think about that. Leaders deciding that it was better to burn their people alive, to turn entire civilizations into ash, because that was the only way to ensure the Enslavers couldn't spread. The fact that such desperate measures were even considered tells you everything about how hopeless the situation had become. Even the Eldar, at the height of their power, could do little more than watch in horror. They had survived the war in heaven, had stood against the might of the Necrons and their Satan overlords. But this was something else entirely. The Eldar relied on their psychic might, on their ability to shape the warp with their thoughts, and that strength was now a weakness. Every Eldar world was a beacon for the Enslavers, a signal fire in the darkness, calling out to the monsters that lurked beyond the veil. The Eldar didn't fight the plague, they fled from it. And yet the Enslavers weren't conquering the galaxy. They weren't ruling these worlds. They had no interest in control or domination. They were parasites, feeding on the psychic energies of their victims, using entire civilizations as fuel for their spread. And once they had drained a world of everything it had to offer, they simply moved on, leaving behind dead planets, empty husks, and the echoes of the minds they had consumed. The records from this time are fragmented, lost in the countless years that followed. But the sheer scale of destruction is undeniable. Some scholars believe that millions of worlds fell, that entire species were wiped from existence, their names and histories erased. The galaxy as we know it today might be nothing more than a graveyard of forgotten empires, buried beneath the weight of this single catastrophe. And here's the real kicker. Nothing stopped them. No grand hero, no last-ditch countermeasure, no miracle breakthrough. The Enslaver plague was not defeated. It simply ended, and no one truly knows why. That's what makes them so terrifying. They weren't pushed back, weren't driven into the shadows by some great resistance. They left on their own. And if they chose to leave once, what's stopping them from coming back? The Enslaver plague wasn't just another galactic disaster. It wasn't a war, a rebellion, or even an invasion in the traditional sense. It was something far worse, an infection of the mind, a psychic cancer that turned entire civilizations into nothing more than breeding grounds for an unstoppable horror. And what made it truly terrifying was that fighting back only made things worse. Think about it. Most threats in the galaxy follow some kind of pattern. A Tyranid hive fleet consumes everything in its path, but it can be repelled with enough firepower. A chaos incursion can be held back by faith, discipline, and overwhelming force. Even the Necrons, as terrifying as they are, follow a certain logic in their destruction. But the Enslavers? They didn't have an army, they didn't have a strategy, they didn't even have a purpose beyond survival. They were like an apocalyptic chain reaction, one that spread on its own, feeding off the very thing that made the galaxy's most powerful civilization strong, psychic potential. That was the first and biggest problem. The more advanced a species was, the more likely it had psychers. The more psychers it had, the easier it was for the Enslavers to infect and spread. This meant that the strongest civilizations, the ones with the greatest control over the warp, were also the most vulnerable. The Eldar, who prided themselves on their mastery of the immaterium, were practically screaming beacons for the Enslavers. Any attempt to use their psychic abilities to resist the invasion only opened more gateways, letting in even more of the creatures. The second reason this threat was so horrifying was that it was invisible until it was too late. When an orc horde attacks, you see them coming. When chaos spreads, you can trace its cults, root them out, and burn them before they grow too strong. But with the Enslavers, there were no warning signs, just a single psyker, lost in their own mind, unknowingly acting as a doorway for something that shouldn't exist in real space. Entire planets could be doomed before anyone realized what was happening, and by then, it was far too late. And then there was the psychological horror. The Enslavers didn't just kill people. They didn't slaughter or destroy in the way that chaos demons or Tyranids do. They turned their victims into living conduits, walking portals to the warp. And the worst part? The victims knew it was happening. Imagine being trapped inside your own body, watching helplessly as your hands move on their own, as your voice speaks words that aren't yours. Imagine seeing your friends, your family, your children being taken over, one by one, until you are the only one left. And then, you feel it. The cold presence slithering into your mind, the tendrils of an unseen horror reaching through the warp, burrowing into your soul. And then, everything goes dark. Some ancient records suggest that the Enslavers' control wasn't complete in the way that chaos possession is. The host was still there, still aware of what was happening, but unable to fight back. A prisoner in their own mind, forced to watch as their body became a tool for the enemy, a beacon to draw in more of the monsters. This wasn't just enslavement. It was annihilation of the self, a fate arguably worse than death. And then there was the sheer scale of the disaster. Most galactic crises are localized in some way. The Horus Heresy nearly tore the Imperium apart, but it was, at its core, a conflict between two factions. The war in heaven was a battle between the Old Ones and the Necrons. But the Enslaver Plague? It was everywhere, all at once. No one was safe. No one knew how to stop it. Even species that had no real understanding of the warp found themselves consumed, as long as just one psyker emerged among them. It wasn't about strength, tactics, or technology. It was about inevitability. There are theories among fans that the only reason the Enslavers didn't completely wipe out all life in the galaxy was because they didn't need to. Once they had drained enough psychic energy, they simply left, retreating back into the warp, waiting for the next time conditions would be perfect for them to return. If that's true, then the galaxy's survival wasn't a victory. It was just a temporary reprieve. And with the state of the galaxy today, with the Great Rift open, with psychers being born at an unprecedented rate, with the Imperium relying more and more on sanctioned psychers and astropaths to keep its crumbling empire together, the same conditions that led to the first plague are happening all over again. And the Enslavers? They're waiting. The Old Ones were the architects of the galaxy, the first great civilization, the closest thing to gods that real space had ever known. They shaped entire species, bent the laws of reality to their will, and fought wars on a scale that modern factions couldn't even begin to comprehend. And yet, despite all their power, they are gone. Their cities, dust, their influence, a fading whisper. The question of how they disappeared has haunted scholars and fan theorists for ages, but one thing is clear. The Enslaver Plague wasn't just a disaster. It was the final nail in the coffin of an already dying empire. The war in heaven was already tearing the galaxy apart. The Old Ones had been locked in a brutal struggle against the Necrons and their Satan overlords, a war that spanned eons and saw the creation of some of the most powerful races in existence. But for all their might, the Old Ones made one critical mistake. They underestimated what their own creations would bring into the galaxy. The war itself was devastating, but what came after was worse. The psychic races that the Old Ones had uplifted, the Eldar, the Krork, countless others, were becoming stronger, more attuned to the warp. But the warp itself was becoming unstable. The suffering, the psychic echoes of a war that lasted millions of years, had turned the Immaterium into something violent and unpredictable. And then, just when the Necrons had nearly wiped out the Old Ones, just when their empire was hanging by a thread, the Enslavers arrived. It was like a death blow to an already wounded giant. The Enslaver Plague spread with terrifying speed, infecting every psychic civilization in its path. The Old Ones, who had relied so heavily on their mastery of the warp, suddenly found themselves completely helpless. Their greatest advantage, their psychic power, was now the very thing that doomed them. And then, just like that, they were gone. No one knows exactly how the Old Ones vanished. Some think the last of them simply fled, retreating to some hidden pocket of the galaxy, watching from the shadows as their former empire crumbled. Others believe they were completely consumed, if not by the Necrons, then by the very forces they had unleashed. And there's a darker theory, one that few dare to consider. What if they weren't just wiped out? What if the Enslavers took them? The idea that some of the most powerful beings to ever exist were reduced to little more than hollowed-out conduits, their minds enslaved, their power fueling the very creatures that destroyed them, is almost too horrifying to imagine. But it would explain why there is no trace of them left, no ruins, no relics of their final days, just emptiness. With the Old Ones gone, the galaxy fell into chaos. Their vast networks collapsed. The species they had uplifted were left to fend for themselves, and most of them didn't survive. The Enslaver Plague burned through world after world, turning psychic civilizations into lifeless husks. And while the Necrons had managed to survive the war, even they couldn't fight something that existed outside the material universe. So they did what Necrons do best. They went to sleep. But what about the Eldar? If they were so psychically powerful, why didn't they fall the same way? The answer lies in what makes the Eldar unique. Unlike the other species the Old Ones had created, the Eldar didn't just have psychic power. They had control. Their minds weren't wild, unrestrained conduits like the early psychers of humanity. Their psychic energy was disciplined, carefully harnessed, directed through ritual and tradition. That gave them just enough of an edge to survive, but only barely. The Eldar might not have been fully consumed, but they were broken. The golden age they had been promised by their creators was gone before it had even begun. Instead of ruling the stars, they were left picking up the pieces of a shattered reality. And from that moment on, they lived in constant fear of what they had seen. This was the first real trauma of the Eldar race. The first moment that shaped their future paranoia, their obsession with control, their need to lock away their own emotions to avoid another catastrophe. And as for humanity, they were nothing more than scattered primitives at this point, too insignificant to be touched by the chaos. If anything, the Enslaver plague might be the only reason humanity even had a chance to rise. The plague burned through the psychic civilizations, wiping out competitors that could have otherwise dominated the stars. When the Enslavers finally faded, they left behind a galaxy emptier than it had ever been. A blank slate, waiting for new rulers to emerge. This is what makes the Enslaver plague so terrifying. It wasn't just another war, another disaster. It was a reset button for the galaxy. Civilizations that had stood for millions of years were wiped away in a matter of centuries. The order that the Old Ones had built was erased, leaving behind only ruins and silence. And the new powers that would rise in the ages to come, the Imperium, the Tau, even the remnants of the Eldar, would never truly understand what came before. But the warp never forgets. And if the Enslavers could do this once, then nothing is stopping them from doing it again. The Enslaver plague should have been the end. By all logic, the galaxy should have been nothing more than a wasteland of hollowed-out civilizations, entire species reduced to empty husks, their psychic energy drained until there was nothing left. And yet, somehow, life survived. The Enslavers didn't consume everything. They didn't spread forever. At some point, they simply vanished. But why? This is one of the great mysteries of Warhammer 40K's history. The Enslavers were an unstoppable force, multiplying exponentially, infecting psychers across entire star systems. There was no army that could stand against them, no technology that could neutralize them, no grand alliance that could push them back. The most powerful civilizations of the time, the Eldar, the remnants of the Old Ones' creations, even the Necrons, were completely helpless. And yet, despite all of this, the Enslaver plague ended. Not with a massive battle, not with some final countermeasure. They just disappeared. The most widely accepted theory among scholars and fans alike is that the warp itself changed. The Immaterium has never been a stable place. It ebbs and flows, constantly shifting in response to the emotions and psychic energy of sentient beings. During the war in heaven, the warp had been flooded with raw, uncontrolled power. The psychic races uplifted by the Old Ones were like supernovae, burning bright and strong, feeding the Immaterium with their energy. It was this abundance of psychic fuel that allowed the Enslavers to thrive. They weren't invaders in the traditional sense. They were parasites, drawn to the massive surges of power coming from the material world. But after the Old Ones were gone, after the Enslaver plague wiped out so many psychic civilizations, something changed. The warp collapsed in on itself. Some believe that without so many active psychers to feed on, the Enslavers simply ran out of energy. They had expanded too fast, consumed too much, and when the galaxy's psychic signal suddenly dimmed, they were left stranded, unable to maintain their presence in real space. Others suggest that the collapse of the psychic web that once connected so many ancient civilizations severed their ability to spread, like a virus that suddenly loses its hosts. And then there's the idea that something forced them back. We know that the Necrons didn't die out completely after the war in heaven. They went into hibernation, waiting for a time when the galaxy would be weak enough for them to rise again. Some believe that before they retreated, they took one final action. They shut down the very conditions that allowed the Enslavers to flourish. The Necrons, after all, despised the warp. Their entire war against the Old Ones was based on the idea that the Immaterium was too dangerous, that psychic energy was an uncontrollable force that would always bring ruin. Some theorists believe that they sealed off parts of the warp, created massive reality stabilizers, or unleashed a kind of technological dampening field that drained psychic energy from entire regions of space. If this theory is true, then the Necrons might be the reason the Enslavers vanished, cutting off their food source and trapping them back in the Immaterium. There's another, far more chilling theory. The Enslavers left because they got what they wanted. The Enslaver Plague wasn't a war. It was a feeding frenzy, a sudden explosion of activity that left the galaxy in ruins. If these creatures are truly immortal, if they exist beyond time as we understand it, then maybe their disappearance wasn't a defeat, but a natural cycle. They came when the conditions were right, they fed until there was nothing left, and then they simply retreated back into the shadows, waiting for the next era of psychic resurgence. But let's say for a moment that the galaxy actually did learn from this catastrophe. What measures were put in place to prevent it from happening again? The Eldar, for their part, became obsessed with control. They had seen firsthand how unrestrained psychic power could destroy civilizations. They had survived the plague only because their minds were disciplined, their power refined. So, they doubled down on their strict mental training, their rigid societal structures. Even now, every Eldar is taught from birth to control their thoughts, to never allow their emotions to spill into the warp unchecked. They build psychic barriers within their own minds, shielding themselves from outside influence. They know, better than anyone, that an open mind is a doorway, and doorways should never be left unguarded. Humanity, ironically, might have been protected simply because it wasn't ready. At the time of the Enslaver Plague, humans were still primitive, scattered across Terra, barely aware of the galaxy beyond their own skies. They didn't have psychers in large enough numbers to draw the Enslavers' attention. But as the Imperium rose, as psychers became more common, the threat didn't disappear. The Imperium's solution? Fear and brutality. The Emperor understood what uncontrolled psychic power could do. He saw the ruins of past civilizations, knew what had happened to the Eldar and others before them. That's why he imposed strict regulations on psychers, creating the Black Ships, the Astronomicon, the Inquisition's Ordo Hereticus. Psychers were not a gift. They were a liability, a threat to be controlled at all costs. And for 10,000 years that approach has worked, but barely. The Great Rift has changed everything. The galaxy is more saturated with psychic energy than ever before. New psychers are being born at an uncontrollable rate. The Imperium is stretched thin, barely able to contain the dangers that lurk within its own borders. And if the theory is true, that the Enslavers have simply been waiting for the right conditions to return, then the conditions are here. If they disappeared because the psychic pulse of the galaxy went silent, what happens now when that pulse is louder than it has been in millions of years? If the Necrons were responsible for sealing them away, what happens when they fully awaken, when their ancient containment systems begin to fail? The Enslavers never needed to be stopped. They just needed to wait. If the Enslavers were to return today, the galaxy wouldn't stand a chance. That's not an exaggeration. That's not grimdark hyperbole. That's just cold, terrifying reality. Everything that allowed them to spread in the past, the abundance of psychers, the instability of the warp, the lack of a united response, is even worse now than it was during the first plague. The conditions that let them nearly wipe out all sentient life are not just present again. They've escalated to a level that makes their resurgence almost inevitable. The Great Rift alone is reason enough to believe the Enslavers could be on their way back. That tear in reality has unleashed a maelstrom of warp energy, flooding the galaxy with raw psychic turbulence on a scale not seen since the war in heaven. Psychers are manifesting at an unprecedented rate, many of them untrained, vulnerable, and completely unprepared for what lurks beyond the veil. Even the Imperium, with all its cruelty and paranoia, cannot control this flood. The black ships can only capture so many. The Scholastica Secana can only train so few. Every world with an uncontrolled psyker is, in essence, a potential gateway waiting to be forced open. And the Enslavers? They don't need chaos cults or warp storms or eldritch rituals to break through. They just need one mind left unprotected. One unlucky psyker experiencing their first uncontrolled awakening, screaming into the void, unaware that something is listening. So what would happen if they did return? The simple answer is that the Imperium would collapse almost immediately. The very structure of the Imperium relies on psychic communication, astropaths sending messages across the stars, navigators guiding ships through the warp, the Emperor's own will channeling through the Astronomicon to keep the Imperium from falling into complete darkness. If the Enslavers infected even a fraction of these key psychers, the effects would be catastrophic. Entire fleets would become lost in the void, cut off from orders, stranded in the depths of space. Planets would be consumed before warnings could even be sent. And the Imperial response? Brutality, as always. The first reaction would be to purge every psyker they could find, regardless of whether they were infected or not. Billions would be executed out of fear alone in a desperate attempt to stop the spread. But fear would not be enough. The Enslavers multiply too quickly, spread too efficiently. The Imperium has survived countless threats, from the Black Crusades to the Tyranids, but all of those were physical, something they could shoot, bomb, or burn. The Enslavers are something else entirely. How do you fight an enemy that already controls your mind before you even know they're there? The Adeptus Mechanicus might stand a slightly better chance. Their disdain for psychers, their reliance on machine-based communication, and their use of purely technological solutions could give them an edge. But even that is no guarantee. If the Enslavers figured out a way to corrupt servitors or machine-augmented humans, then even Mars itself could fall. And considering the Mechanicus' reliance on tech priests with cybernetic brains that still function off biological components, the idea that they are immune to psychic infestation is naive at best. And what about chaos? Would the Dark Gods care? Would they intervene to stop the Enslavers from consuming the galaxy? Probably not. Chaos thrives on destruction. If the Enslavers rip through the Imperium and the Eldar, that just means more death, more suffering, more souls to be tormented in the warp. The ruinous powers don't have an army to fight them, nor do they have any reason to. To them, the Enslavers are just another storm in the endless sea of madness. The Eldar would panic, of course. They barely survived the first plague, and their numbers are a fraction of what they once were. They don't have an empire anymore, just a dying remnant scattered across craft worlds and hidden enclaves. The moment they realize the Enslavers are back, they would probably isolate themselves entirely, cutting off all psychic communication, making sure no one, not even their own kind, could be used as a conduit. But that would only buy them time. If the Enslavers spread too far, even the webway might not be safe. The Necrons, ironically, might be the only faction capable of truly fighting back. They have no psychers, no connection to the warp. Their minds are closed systems, completely immune to the kind of psychic domination the Enslavers rely on. If they recognized the threat, if they woke up in large enough numbers, they could potentially act as a countermeasure. But here's the thing. The Necrons don't care about saving the galaxy. They care about reclaiming it for themselves. If the Enslavers returned, they wouldn't launch some heroic defense. They would watch the galaxy burn, let the lesser races suffer, and then clean up the remains. Some believe the Orcs could resist, that their sheer brute force psychic nature might make them immune. After all, Orcs don't experience fear the same way other races do. Their psychic field is a collective consciousness, fueled by belief rather than weakness. Maybe, just maybe, the enslavers wouldn't be able to bend them to their will. But there's also the terrifying possibility that the orcs would just become another conduit, spreading the plague even faster. Imagine an entire wah of mind-controlled orcs, each one acting as a living beacon, summoning more enslavers into real space. That wouldn't just be a threat, that would be the end of everything. So is there any hope at all? The sad truth is that the galaxy barely survived the first plague when it was in a much better state. Now, with the Imperium fractured, the warp more unstable than ever, and psychers emerging at an uncontrollable rate, the return of the enslavers would be apocalyptic. The best anyone could hope for would be containment, cutting off entire sectors of space, sacrificing billions in the hopes of slowing the spread. But once the enslavers have a foothold, once they start pouring through the cracks in reality, it's only a matter of time before there's nothing left. And the worst part? They could already be here. The warp is vast, chaotic, unknowable. Just because we haven't seen the enslavers in recent millennia doesn't mean they aren't lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the perfect moment to return. Every uncontrolled psyker, every desperate astropath reaching into the void could be the first crack in the dam. And when that dam breaks, the enslaver plague won't just return. It will finish what it started. The idea that the enslavers completely disappeared is something that a lot of people just take for granted. The official lore says they burned through the galaxy, consumed entire civilizations, and then left. Just like that. No grand battle, no last stand, no miracle cure. One moment they were spreading like wildfire, and the next they were gone. That alone is suspicious. The problem with this explanation is that nothing in Warhammer 40k ever truly disappears. Every great catastrophe, every ancient horror, every so-called extinct species always finds a way to resurface. The Necrons were once just a vague myth, their tombs buried and forgotten, until they started waking up. The Tyranids weren't even known until Hive Fleet Behemoth made its way into the galaxy, and now we realize they've been watching from the void for who knows how long. The same logic applies to the Enslavers. Just because they're not actively rampaging across the stars doesn't mean they aren't still out there. There are already hints in the lore that they never really left. They just went dormant, waiting for the right conditions to return. Some of the most ancient texts on warp entities describe creatures that behave disturbingly similar to enslavers, but under different names. The Krell, the Siren, the Hollow Masters, different civilizations, different time periods, yet always the same whispers of a threat that bends minds and spreads like a virus. Could it be that small enslaver incursions have always been happening, just on a scale too minor for the Imperium to notice? And then there's the real smoking gun, the state of the galaxy right now. If the enslavers needed high levels of psychic activity to spread, then this is the best time in millennia for them to make their move. The Great Rift alone has turned the warp into an uncontrollable nightmare, psychic energy spilling into reality with almost no resistance. The sheer number of rogue psychers appearing across the Imperium has skyrocketed. If the enslavers are still lurking in the depths of the Immaterium, they're probably already testing the waters. Some fan theories suggest that they never even left real space, but instead found ways to survive in the shadows. There are reports, scattered, unreliable, of worlds that go completely dark. No distress calls, no signs of invasion, no planetary upheaval. Just silence. Entire populations vanish, with no trace of destruction. Could it be that these planets aren't being devoured by Tyranids or overrun by chaos? Could it be that they're falling to a slow, quiet resurgence of the enslaver plague? There's also the fact that warp-based possession is on the rise. The Imperium blames chaos for most unexplained possessions, and in many cases that's a fair assessment. Demons are opportunistic. They'll take any chance to slip into real space. But there are cases, rare ones, where possession doesn't fit the usual demonic profile. No connection to any chaos god, no worship, no ritual, no taint of the ruinous powers. Just minds being taken over, voices speaking in alien tongues, entire crews of void ships falling silent and turning into obedient, hollowed-out thralls. That doesn't sound like chaos. That sounds like something else. And then we have the Eldar. If anyone knows what's really happening behind the curtain, it's them. They survived the first plague, barely, and they've spent the last several millennia trying to make sure it never happens again. There are rumors, fleeting mentions in obscure lore, that the Eldar still monitor the enslaver threat, that some of their seers have foreseen their return, and that craft worlds have entire hidden protocols designed for the sole purpose of containing another outbreak before it starts. If that's true, then the enslavers never really left. The Eldar just found a way to keep them on a leash. But the most disturbing theory of all? What if the enslavers are just waiting? We assume that they disappeared because their food source dried up, that they ran out of psychers to feed on and had no choice but to retreat into the warp. But what if that was just part of their natural cycle? What if they don't spread indefinitely, but rather hibernate, waiting until the next psychic golden age before they emerge again? If that's the case, then their resurgence isn't just possible, it's inevitable. And looking at the state of the galaxy today, with psychers more numerous than ever, the warp in absolute turmoil, and the Imperium stretched to its breaking point, well, let's just say that if they were planning a comeback, now would be the perfect time. When people talk about the biggest threats in Warhammer 40k, the usual suspects always come up. The Tyranids, Chaos, the Necrons. These are the big names, the horrors that keep even the most battle-hardened warriors awake at night. But there's something about the Enslavers that makes them feel different. Maybe it's because they don't fit neatly into any category. They aren't an invading xenospecies like the Tyranids. They aren't an organized force like Chaos, and they aren't ancient rulers reclaiming the galaxy like the Necrons. There's something worse, a force of nature, an uncontrollable, unreasoning apocalyptic event that doesn't care about war, about conquest, or even about survival in the way we understand it. They just spread. So how do they compare to the galaxy's other existential nightmares? Chaos is obviously the first comparison. Demons, the ruinous powers, all the insanity that spills out of the warp whenever reality gets too weak to hold it back. The thing about Chaos, though, is that it's predictable in its own way. It thrives on emotions, hatred, ambition, fear, desire. It wants worship. It wants dominion. Even the worst demons, the most horrifying greater demons or chaos gods, have personalities, motives, things that can be understood and, to some degree, manipulated. You can bargain with chaos. You can exploit it. You can even, if you're insane enough, use it for your own ends. The Enslavers? There's no bargaining, no manipulation, no ideology, no grand ambition. They don't want to rule. They don't care about corrupting anything. They just consume and multiply, and once they've burned through a population, they simply move on. Some argue that demonic possession is more terrifying because it involves corruption of the soul, twisting the host into something vile and monstrous. But even that implies a purpose behind the suffering. The Enslavers don't corrupt. They hollow you out, leave you a prisoner in your own body, while your mind is used as a gateway for even more of them to pour through. There's no madness, no transformation into something new, just obliteration of the self, turning entire populations into mindless, obedient extensions of something that doesn't even recognize them as individuals. Then there's the Tyranids, the other great plague of the galaxy. The Tyranids are relentless, an ever-consuming swarm that can strip entire planets bare in a matter of days. They don't need allies, don't care about diplomacy, and can't be reasoned with. Sounds familiar, right? That's what makes them so terrifying. And yet, there's something fundamentally different between the Tyranids and the Enslavers. The Tyranids have a hunger, a biological imperative that drives them forward. They devour and adapt. They consume and evolve. They have the hive mind, a vast intelligence that coordinates their efforts, learns from their enemies, and grows stronger with every battle. This means that, in some way, you can still fight them. Their numbers are endless, their strategies overwhelming, but they still function within a logical framework. You can study them, analyze their weaknesses, and figure out ways to slow them down. The Imperium, for all its flaws, has found methods to resist the Tyranids, even if it's a constant uphill battle. The Enslavers don't learn, they don't adapt, they just appear, infect, and spread. There's no way to fight them because by the time you even realize they're there, it's already too late. With the Tyranids, at least you know what's coming. With the Enslavers, the moment they start taking over, the battle is already lost. Then we have the Necrons, the galaxy's ancient kings, the deathless legions of machine warriors who seek to reclaim their lost empire. Of all the major factions, they might be the only ones truly immune to the Enslaver threat. They have no psychers, no minds that can be twisted and used as gateways. If anything, they might even be the reason the Enslavers disappeared in the first place, their ancient anti-warp technology acting as a natural countermeasure to psychic infestations. In a strange way, the Necrons might be the only thing standing between the galaxy and another Enslaver plague. But that doesn't make them allies. If anything, they'd probably just let the Enslavers do their work, wipe out the lesser species, and then take the galaxy for themselves when the dust settles. And then there are the Dark Horse threats, the things that aren't as openly apocalyptic as Chaos, Tyranids, or Necrons, but still have the potential to destroy everything. The Catan, the remnants of the Old One's failed creations, the strange and unknowable horrors lurking in the webway. Could they stand against the Enslavers? Maybe. Would they even care? Probably not. The thing about the Enslavers is that they don't operate within the same kind of conflicts that define most of the setting. They aren't an army, they aren't a kingdom, they aren't a faction with an agenda. They're an infection, a reality-breaking phenomenon that spreads faster than anyone can react. That's why, in some ways, they are the scariest of all the galactic horrors. Not because they're the strongest, not because they have the biggest armies or the most advanced technology, but because they represent something that can't be stopped by conventional means. You can fight demons. You can wage war against Tyranids. You can resist the Necrons. But how do you fight something that already has control over your leaders, your military, your communication networks, before you even realize it's happening? The Enslaver plague didn't fail. It just stopped spreading. And we still don't know why. That alone makes them one of the most terrifying entities in the galaxy. Because if they ever come back, the question isn't who will stop them. It's who will even realize what's happening before it's too late. The Enslaver plague is one of those terrifying moments in Warhammer 40K history that almost feels too big to fully comprehend. It wasn't just another war, another invasion, another cycle of destruction and rebirth that defines the galaxy. It was something different, something unnatural, an event that didn't just topple empires, but threatened to wipe out all sentient life entirely. And yet, somehow, it ended. The Enslavers vanished, their influence faded, and the galaxy moved on, as it always does. But did it really? The sheer mystery surrounding their disappearance makes them one of the most unsettling threats the setting has ever known. Every other existential crisis in the galaxy has some kind of answer, some historical explanation. The Necrons went to sleep. The Eldar collapsed under their own decadence. The Tyranids are an ongoing nightmare, but they have a goal, a pattern that can at least be analyzed. The forces of chaos may be endless, but they are also predictable in their corruption and ambitions. The Enslavers, they just left, and that's what makes them so uniquely horrifying. There was no great countermeasure that saved the galaxy, no coordinated effort that pushed them back. They weren't stopped. They simply retreated, as if they had taken everything they needed, or as if something, some unknowable force, drove them away. That lingering uncertainty is what keeps them firmly in the realm of the most terrifying and forgotten horrors of the setting. And now, the galaxy is in a worse state than it has ever been. The Great Rift has shattered reality, psychic activity is at an all-time high, and factions that once stood strong are now teetering on the edge of collapse. If the Enslavers were truly waiting for the right moment to return, this would be it. Some fans believe they never left at all. that they are still here, lurking beneath the surface, influencing events in ways we don't yet understand. That every unexplained mass disappearance, every rogue psyker who vanishes without a trace, every void ship lost in the warp without a single distress signal could be evidence that they are testing the waters again. If that's true, then it means the next plague might not be a sudden catastrophe like the first one. It could already be happening, slowly, silently, and by the time the galaxy realizes what's going on, it will already be too late. So, what do you think? Are the Enslavers just a forgotten relic of the past, another mystery lost to time? Or are they still out there waiting for the right conditions to emerge again? And if they do return, is there anything left in the galaxy that could actually stop them? Let's talk about it in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Warhammer 40k's most terrifying and underrated horrors, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Because in a galaxy this dark, there's always another nightmare lurking in the shadows.